Well, a warm welcome to everybody attending this event this week. It gives me great pleasure to host it. It's a special launch, even at GSF, to celebrate the publication of a book called Britain's Persuaders, Soft Power in a Hard World. This is a new book written by Professor Michael Clarke and Helen Ramscar, both of whom are well known to GSF because they were here to talk about their earlier book 2 years ago before we were all locked down, and it was a good session that, so I'm looking forward to another good session here today. The new book is being published by IB Tauris Bloomsbury this week. The event we're having today is a hybrid one, in the sense that we have an audience here in the National Liberal Club, which I'm delighted to see after these months of talking to meetings of GSF with no audience visible. I'm very pleased to see everybody here today. We are also live streaming it so that our remote audience can see it too, and I welcome them as well today. Before I start, just one or two housekeeping notes. We'll be taking questions from both the in-person and remote audience. For those who are joining the webinar, if you'd like to ask a question, please can you, and this is important, submit it in writing through the question and answer function, and when the time comes, we'll aim obviously to try and take as many questions as we can on your behalf. We will be recording the event, and we will make the recording available online as soon as possible. Details of how to access it via our YouTube channel will be posted on our website, which is, as you know, www.globalstrategyforum.org. For those on Twitter, we'll be tweeting the event on GSF's account using the hashtag Britain's Persuaders. So those are the organisational notes, but I do again stress, if you want to ask a question, put it down in writing and then we'll sort it out at this end. I was delighted to be asked to launch this book, Britain's Persuaders, at Global Strategy Forum. I'm very pleased to have with me here in the National Liberal Club the two authors, or one author, Michael Clarke, and joining us from Switzerland, Helen Ramscar, who's appearing on our screen. So we'll get it from both the authors. And also today with me is Hannah Vaughan-Jones. Hannah will be known to many of you from her role as a news anchor on CNN. She's an extremely experienced broadcaster and journalist, and I'm very pleased to be able to welcome you here today to GSF. Later on, she will be discussing the book with Mike and Helen in more detail. I don't really need, I think, to introduce Michael Clarke, but I will do so. He's a very familiar face to our GSF audience. He's a regular speaker, and he's chaired certain of our meetings. He was Director General of the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, from 2007 to 2015, and he remains a distinguished fellow there. He's an advisor to 2 parliamentary committees and an Associate Director of the Strategy and Security Institute at the University of Exeter. He's also, perhaps most importantly, a member of our advisory board at GSF, and I'm delighted he's here to again give us the benefit of his formidable defence and foreign policy experience and knowledge. Helen Ramscar is an Associate Fellow at RUSI. She's worked at the House of Commons, the Royal Household and the United States Embassy in London. She is a graduate of Durham University, SOAS and Cass Business School. They both last spoke together at GSF back in December 2019 when they gave a presentation to us on the previous book they co-authored, which was called Tipping Point: Britain, Brexit and Security in the 2020s. In many ways, Britain's Persuaders takes off where that excellent analysis finished, and I was lucky enough to receive an advance copy and the inventory of our soft power, and can say very firmly the book provides a very timely introduction, particularly in the context of unpicking the reality and rhetoric of what global Britain might actually mean. We keep on being told about global Britain, but nobody's quite sure what it actually entails. The book, I may say, is beautifully written and thoughtful, and it's persuasive, and it makes a fascinating read, and I hope you will all take advantage of that by either buying it or finding some other way of getting to read it. Mike and Helen will present for about 10 minutes each on the themes in this book, and then Hannah will take over, and she will spend about 15 minutes in discussion with them both before inviting questions both from the audience here in the National Liberal Club and those tuning in online. Now, last but not least, Bloomsbury are here today with copies of the book for sale. We have a special price of £11 if you'd like to buy a copy, and I must recommend you to do so. But for those not here today, there is a web discount code, which is, I'm going to spell it out because I'm not sure how to pronounce it otherwise. PERSUADERS 11 UK, which you can use at the checkout on the Bloomsbury website. And the full details of that are on our website too. Without further ado then, Mike, I'm going to hand over to you, and then Helen. Tell us, so you can tell us about Britain's Persuaders and what it's all about and why you and Helen decided to write it. And then after that, I will be handing over to our arbiter for the day.
Okay.
Okay, Michael, thank you very much. Yes, thank you all for being here. It's a great pleasure always to speak with the GSF and here at the great National Liberal Club. And thank you all for tuning in out there, wherever you are. We began this book, as Michael said, because we finished Tipping Point, this book in 2019, in which we observed that the world was getting tougher for the Europeans, all the Europeans, including Britain. We said that the 2020s is going to be a fairly uncomfortable decade for the middle powers. And we talked a little bit about soft power in this book, but we wanted to develop it a little bit further. And so we thought about this question of soft power in a hard world. And it is a hard world, partly because it's hard to understand, it's very complex, but it's also a hard world because, as we've said in both books, the political weather is being set by the big four: America, China, Russia, and India. And they are the big four for different reasons. But the geopolitical wheels of those four powers are turning pretty quickly now, and that gives real challenges, creates real challenges for the Europeans, all the European, the middle powers, and of course for Britain. So it is a hard world, and in this hard world, the Europeans will find it much more difficult to use their coercive hard power, whatever that means. We do talk about that. They will rely much more on their soft power. They'll rely much more on their societies, the attractions of their societies, in order to try to shape the world in the way that they wanted. So we believe that this is a good time to talk about soft power. And we try to define it a little bit more. Most people think that, well, that everyone has an intuitive sense of soft power. They say, well, hard power is military, isn't it? And soft power is diplomacy and culture and arts and sport and so on. Well, no, it isn't. It's not what the thing is, it is how it is used. After all, I mean, arts and culture and sport can be used in a pretty hard way. If you say, well, we're not going to go to the World Cup next year, we're not going to send teams, or we're going to cancel orchestra visits to X or Y because we disapprove of your policy, you're trying to use art as a coercive instrument. And equally, the British military goes around the world doing things. Part of the job of exercising and offering military support and technical assistance is to create a good feeling about the British military. Because what one is trying to do is to create a sense of imitation. People like what they see the British military doing, so they think, well, we'd like to be like that. We'd like to organise ourselves like that. We'd like to train like that. And so this issue about what is hard and what is soft power, it's really about how the instruments are used. And so in a sense, to put it very briefly, I mean, hard power is about trying to project the coercive or pressurizing ability to persuade others to do something. Soft power is much more about magnetism. It doesn't try to project, it just is. Soft power is magnetic. It is the power of imitation. And the most important elements of a society that has soft power, that is able to engage in soft power policy, is a society that seems to be stable and law-abiding, prosperous, and in which there is opportunity. It comes down to really basic things: stable, law-abiding, prosperous, where there is opportunity. And that makes societies very attractive. And any society that can that can attract imitation, that can actually encourage others to imitate it, is obviously helping to structure the outside world in a way that's very much to its own advantage. So we try to look at why the world is a hard world, why soft power is more important in that world, and to do that, we try to take a couple of steps back and think about power. Just in the first part of the book, we look at the abstractions of power. Why is power important in politics? It's fundamental to politics. And the two most important factors of power is, one is that all power is a relationship. A man or woman washed up on a desert island with a suitcase with £10 million in it is not a rich person, because the money doesn't relate to anything they want, anything they need. But £10 million in London, in the middle of London, gives you wealth, gives you power. Power is a relationship. It's not a commodity. You may have military capacity, but unless you can apply it in a way to get what you think you want, then it doesn't give you power. So power is a relationship. And because it's a relationship, power is perceptual. It's the way people see it. And therefore, in the globalized world, soft power is fundamentally about relationships, about perception. And we look a little bit about what we call the new information order, where in a sense, to believe something is partly to make it true. Look at the great illusion that is awash in the United States among a significant minority of Americans that the election was stolen. That's purely created. It's a piece of political reality now that has no basis in established fact, but it's out there. There is a reality to it. So this matter of relationships and perception is very important. And finally, by way of introduction, once we started to think about power, we realized, of course, that it doesn't reside in very much that governments do. We come back to that in the conclusion. It's not really about what governments are up to. It's about society. It's about the nature of society and the institutions of a society. So we asked ourselves, in Britain's case, we assumed that Britain is quite high in soft power stakes, and it seems to be. So how does it express itself? What are the soft power instruments that Britain seems to have? And so we asked ourselves, who are the persuaders and what do they do? And at that point, I should hand over to my very good friend and co-author, Helen, who will talk about some of the issues that we looked at in trying to pin down who Britain's persuaders really are.
Yes, thank you. We can all think of lots of obvious examples of British soft power, the royal family, and today the Prince of Wales setting off on his 4-day visit to the Middle East on behalf of the British government, a classic example. The global reach of the BBC broadcast in 212 countries, the Premier League and so forth. These are all often cited and for very good reason. But Michael and I were surprised by the range of less obvious examples when we looked more closely. We focused on 9 types of behaviour that we feel encapsulate British soft power. And these 9 types of behaviour may be expressed or understood in terms of the way in which British institutions and individuals contribute to, firstly, Britain's convening power, bringing interests together. It's not just the big showpiece summits like COP26, very important as they are, but a diffuse range of less obvious ones, like the convening power of Lambeth Palace in London, for example, the convening organisation of the Anglican Communion of 85 million adherents in 165 countries. Britain's indirect diplomacy, British officials speaking softly, speaking effectively to help shape the international environment. In declassified files of President Nixon, there's a smashing example of a conversation he has with his national security advisor, a young Henry Kissinger, where Nixon says, the British are bright and they think strategically, and I think the right British guy is better than the right guy in the State Department. That's reputation, that soft power reputation. More recent example, we can take the Skripal assassination attempt, which elevated Salisbury Cathedral on the world map like never before. But the real soft power example here is that British officials, when they pointed their conclusions that this was Russian-led, the international community believed that. They didn't believe Russian denials. And in turn, the effectiveness, soft power effectiveness, can be seen in how the number of Russian diplomats that were expelled rapidly across countries. So that sense of indirect diplomacy, speaking softly, speaking effectively, is a striking example. We looked at British research and innovation shaping the global stage. The AstraZeneca vaccine is a good example here. That it's perceived as a British vaccine is interesting to me in both that the team behind it is made up of 36, no less than 36 nationalities. That's British multiculturalism in action, but also how that vaccine has elevated Britain's biomedical sector on the international stage. The conditions necessary to bring about research and innovation recognised around the world, and that's the point of soft power reputation. They're hard to create. You can't magic them overnight, but Britain has strong educational and research hinterland from which skills and innovation can arise. There's intellectual freedom within Britain's research communities. An interesting metric is Britain's publishing output. It's very considerable. Britain fields something 4%, over 4% of all active researchers in the world, despite only constituting 0.8% of the global population. So it's from this research and innovation landscape of already shaping the international stage that global Britain aspires to emerge as the science and tech superpower we hear about in recent announcements. We examined Britain's leaders in setting international standards, leaders in finance, in architecture, publishing, and so forth. The British Standards Institute was founded in 1901 as the world's first national standards body. The British kite mark is recognised by consumers worldwide. But there are less obvious examples of British soft power impact. And one is, for example, the national regulator, the MHRA, the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. This is the body that approves a drug for a market in the UK. It approved the AstraZeneca vaccine, for example. The MHRA is highly recognised as an authority within the international regulatory community. For example, the International Medicines Agency operates a committee that decides if a drug can go to use across all the EU member states. And what it does is has a committee with 2 national countries and picked for their expertise in the therapy area and their experience in conducting rigorous scientific evaluations. Before Brexit, when the MHRA sat within the EMA, the UK's regulator was selected more times than any EU member state for this really important role. So these are less obvious examples of Britain's soft power reputation really held highly within the sector. We looked at Britain's diasporas and cosmopolitans and how they reflect global cultures. As has been said many times, Britain is a country of immigration and cultural mixing, going back to Roman times. There's a long-standing experience of tolerance and refuge. There's also very uncomfortable realities, scandals, failures. Britain's multiculturalism can be seen as a driver of soft power magnetism when it creates that cosmopolitan, when it creates cities like fabulous cities like London, desired the world over. And the diasporas within the UK are important in communicating that image of Britain as prosperous, stable, tolerant society, one with opportunities, one where you can live your life with your rights protected and under the rule of law. Multiculturalism can also diminish sense of a country's social cohesion and stability, for example, when poor social mobility creates powerful images of exclusion. So it's a complicated one in terms of soft power reputation, and it's very much under the spotlight in the UK at the moment. We looked at British educators pursuing truth and truthfulness. The formal schools and formal institution schools and universities that consistently score high rankings are known to us all. And even before the pandemic, the exponential growth of online and distance learning is interesting. We looked, however, at British individuals who contribute to Britain's reputation for pursuing truth and truthfulness. Really, we grew up with Patrick Moore, Richard Dawkins. I find it really touching that David Attenborough in his 90s is a hero to the youth worldwide for his curiosity and pursuit of truthfulness in terms of knowledge of the natural world that he's brought to so many of us for decades. Bellingcat is another example of pursuing truth that's their example of is being emulated elsewhere. And perhaps so close to Remembrance Day, it's interesting to reflect on one of the more poignant British individuals who continue to have a lasting educative influence around the world. The unknown soldier entombed in Westminster Abbey in 1920 continues to provide inspiration that's emulated in no fewer than 55 countries around the world, representing not just the unnamed dead, but also that deeper principle that war dead is the price society pays for conflict. We looked at British creatives bringing new ideas to the world. We looked at advertising, one of the most unashamedly persuasive occupations, and Britain's been leading on it for a long time. Alfred Leet's famous Lord Kitchener's quoting "Your country needs you" has been replicated in other countries and resonates even today. It's a global brand. Saatchi and Saatchi's "Labour isn't working" slogan of the 1979 campaign was adopted in 2012 by the US Mitt Romney's campaign, saying that Obama isn't working. The advertising, marketing, consulting, Britain's literary stars, great storytellers from Shakespeare to J.K. Rowling. It's computer game creators, a really fantastic space at the moment. It's artists across all genres. For all the caricature of British reserve and aloofness, British creativity, perhaps more importantly, the tolerance of eccentricity is a real soft power strength in driving that creativity within British society. We looked at British entertainers feeding a human need worldwide, British filmmakers, and by that, the whole production pipeline behind the scenes, where Britain and particular spots around London are absolutely excellent. The winning television formulas of Top Gear, MasterChef, Pop Idol, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, Strictly Come Dancing, X Factor, all of those. Britain's music stars that with smashing album sales, its international stars mobbed in shopping malls, Formula One, football, rugby, cricket, athletics, boxing. These are all of these together are really striking examples, not least the Paralympic Games, thanks to the work of Ludwig Budmann, a Jewish neurologist who fled Nazi Germany in the 30s and operated out of Stoke Mandeville Hospital. And through his work with his patients and tireless campaigning, got the Stoke Mandeville Games alongside the 1960 Rome Olympics. And thereafter, the Paralympic Games have been enshrined as part of the whole Games experience. The particular individuals and successes is not so much the point. They'll change from sport, genre to genre, and from era to era. But the soft power point here is that Britain can breed success across the board. And it's because of that underlying premise of British society allowing for opportunity, for freedom, for openness, for human endeavour. And in the final chapter of British stars and bloggers exploring the anarchic, I'm smiling because it's something of a favourite, I think, for both of us. We looked at British individualism as a national characteristic, not so much one consumed by celebrity for celebrity's sake. It's a fascinating meld of individualism and altruism when we looked at some charitable giving figures alongside it. The renowned war surgeon David Knott is a really good example of British individual, someone going it alone outside normal channels for that altruistic aim as well. Our conclusions are partly based on data we gathered into the appendix of the book. Various statistics viewed together portray British soft power declining over the last decade, while other powers appear to be on the rise. But the decline, while noticeable, in our view, it's not dramatic or irreversible. Certainly not. There's certainly time to behave more strategically about British soft power and to play to Britain's soft power strengths much, much better.
If I can just take it up from there, the conclusions of the book, we talk about what governments can do, and that's a separate thing really for policymakers. But in a way, our overall conclusion is that this situation that we find ourselves in, there's a lot of useful things that we do. Our society is very vigorous in so many ways. But we think that the situation for British soft power is both better and worse than a lot of people think it is. It's better than a lot of the, what we've got in the appendix, a lot of the statistical material would indicate, because our society is robust. It showed itself to be very robust in the last decade. It's taken quite a beating in lots of different ways from the financial crisis of 2008, but it's very robust, and it still maintains institutions and law and order and stability and optimism, a lot of optimism. So it's very robust. But in some ways it's worse, because the challenges are greater, and we shouldn't underestimate the challenges. And the three challenges we look at, I'll just list them. First of all is to make a success of Brexit. After all, Brexit was based on the idea that there's a sort of British exceptionalism, that we are significantly different to our European friends, is to feel that we don't want to be on the same journey that they are on within the European Union. So that was a pretty big bet on British society and the exceptional nature of British society. So one, we've got to make a success of Brexit. Two is the prospect of dissolution. If the United Kingdom breaks up, that would be the biggest single blow to just about everything in our soft power. It'd take an awful lot of recovering from, because any power, any country that suffers secession is automatically a failure. It has failed to keep all its bits together. And however you dress that up, there's no avoiding it. And so the way in which that is handled over the next decade will be very critical. And then the third great challenge is integrity, that we are known as a law-abiding country with integrity. That's part of our self-image, it's part of our image around the world. Not so easy to keep hold of these days, and that is a pretty big challenge in modern conditions. So our conclusion is that our situation is both better and more challenging than it is often thought to be, but British society is vigorous. Our lament, in a sense, is that governments don't seem to understand soft power as well as they should, because if they understood it better, then they might make their policy more consistent with what Britain really is.
Well, thank you to Mike and to Helen. Hello, everyone. Fascinating to hear from both the authors. My name's Hannah Vaughan-Jones, and it's a real privilege for me to be here with you and our distinguished authors, and Lord Lothian as well, with the Global Strategy Forum. I have to give you full disclosure. Helen and Mike are friends of mine, but there were no powers of persuasion necessary, and neither hard nor soft, to get me to come here today and to fire some questions at you as well. I promise not to be too CNN about it all. It will be much, much nicer for the next 15, 20 minutes or so. And as Lord Lothian said at the beginning as well, should you have any questions that are pertinent to what you're hearing right at the time, please do just raise your hand if you're in the room. And indeed, of course, if you are watching us virtually as well, pose your questions as we're going along, and we'll try to get to as many of them through the course of the conversation as well. So my first question for you both is, which is better, hard or soft?
The answer is you need both. Hard power is most effective when there's a bit of soft power there, when there's legitimacy behind it, persuasiveness, imitation. But equally, soft power is much more effective when there's a hard power element as well. So what we're really talking about is, they call it smart power. It's being able to put the two together. The problem is that policymakers and Whitehall warriors, they all gravitate towards the hard end of the spectrum, because that's where the obvious levers are. There's levers they can pull. When they think about the soft power end of the spectrum, it's harder to find the levers. So they tend to gravitate always towards one end. That's really our point.
Helen, would you say that in the UK, we have to grasp and endeavour to utilise, apply our soft power, simply because the hard power that was once available to us is now just not there? We have no choice but to embrace the soft power.
Sorry, I lost you for a moment there, but I think I got the second part of the question in terms of embracing our soft power levers. Yes, and slightly adding to your first question, I find the soft power element probably more exciting at the moment, because there is a limited number of hard power levers to pull: your military might, your economic sanctions, etc. But I think our book shows that in terms of soft power, the range of overt ones and less overt, the ones that governments can influence, the one that are independent of government, the whole myriad of soft power levers is so much more interesting and exciting in terms of the potential that's there.
It's one of the reasons why I ask, I suppose, is because I found this, I raced through this book and the last one, but I found this one definitely far more optimistic than the last one. So it was lovely to think as a Brit that there are things, there's a reason to smile, that we have quite a lot in our arsenal, as it were. What would you say, though, to, say, one of the big four, to China, and how should China approach soft power? Does it even factor in soft power into its planning?
I think it certainly does, and the explosion of Confucius institutes worldwide is cited as an example of China understanding its need to develop a soft power strategy. But I think it's like a lot of nations at the moment, the vaccine and its response to COVID is probably where it wants to demonstrate itself as both an effective global health leader in the midst of a global crisis. It can take on this real leadership role and provide at speed and scale a countermeasure that can really help and save the world. Its global health Silk Road, an avenue of soft power as part of its foreign policy. Those are the areas where I think it will be wanting to focus its soft power efforts, but whether it's successful or not is to be seen, because underlying it all is that sense of openness, of truthfulness, of rigor in the approval of your countermeasures, your sharing of your scientific data and things. These narratives are running counter to that soft power desire, and that narrative, that war of narratives, is going to play out for quite some time.
And Mike, you mentioned in your opening comments about the importance of having powers of imitation, and one wonders what China's powers of imitation are.
Exactly, yeah. Think about the things that really make a society attractive. China can offer order and stability, for sure, at the moment. Can it offer prosperity? Maybe, maybe not, that depends. Can it offer opportunity? Maybe, maybe not, that depends. Because what China is engaged in is the great experiment of the 21st century, which is whether a country of 1 billion odd people can have a communist government and still have an essentially capitalist performing economy. I mean, if they make it, if they do, we'll have to rewrite all of the political science textbooks from the last 150 years, because it's not allowed. You're not supposed to be able to do that. If they do, they will have defied every ounce of political philosophy for many generations.
And adding to that as well, you talked about freedom of expression, and China, arguably, with the likes of artists, Ai Weiwei and the like. Yeah. Not many people would necessarily want to imitate that. I would
no, and the question is, can China provide the atmosphere, the sort of society and institutions which allow people to explore what they want to explore? The reason that we have had so much soft power magnetism is because people find in this society there's a place where you can be yourself. And although here we are in the National Liberal Club, I mean, we're very straight-laced, but actually we're not. We pretend we are, but we're not.
Is Britain's soft power an accident of history or a result of deliberate policy?
It's very much an accident of history, in the sense that, if you look at the way British history developed, and again, this exceptionalism that a lot of people discern in Britain's background, there has been something in the traditions of political thinking in Britain, which created the empire of the 18th century, which was so influential in influencing the rest of the world. The question for us in the 21st century is, are we hanging on to an old-fashioned framework that we really can't enforce in any case, or are we moving with the times? Are we on the right side of history? That's the question we have to ask ourselves.
And hard then for policymakers going forward to think, well, it was all just an accident of history in the past, but how do we actually incorporate it now into what we do in the future? And which brings me to my question to you, Helen, about 2022, when you talk in the book about it being a big, big year. Just how big is it, and why is it so important for Britain?
Well, there are a lot of events scheduled for 2022 that big soft power events in terms of the Queen's Platinum Jubilee that'll be marked on the 6th of February, and hopefully a 4-day celebration come June. The Festival of Britain, which has been renamed various times, celebrating British creativity and innovation. There'll be anniversaries of the likes of the Good Friday Agreement, and Scottish and Welsh devolution are all around this period of time. So there's spotlights on British society that we elevate as soft power assets. But it's to be seen how the next few weeks and months go, never mind next year. Pandemic certainly has an impact on that. But in principle, it's an exciting year for British soft power if it can all come together.
Moving, I'm going to come back to the Sussexes because I do have a question about them, but I'll bring that. I'll leave that in the end. That's fine. Moving on to Brexit and Britain's Brexit sort of endeavour, shambles, as some people might call it. Has it been so complicated simply because it was led not by the kind of historic, softly diplomatic approach of the past, and instead it's been led by Number 10?
Well, it was always going to be difficult. You can't go in for this sort of major strategic change, the biggest for 50 or 60 years, without some big degree of dislocation. And arguably, because it was a relatively marginal decision, 52-48%, it was not going to be so easy to sell to the public as a whole. So you could argue, well, the only way Brexit was ever going to happen is if somebody gripped it by the neck and pushed it through politically. And you can say, I mean, that's how the NHS was established, in the teeth of a lot of opposition. And here we are, the NHS is our national religion, as it's often said. So I'm sympathetic in a way to the political push that had to be made in order to achieve it. So, but now that we are where we are, we have got to make the most of this British exceptionalism, whatever that means. And as Lord Lothian said, we've got to make global Britain mean something.
Right.
And we've got to convince ourselves that we mean it, as well as the outside world. And it'll take a long time, 10 to 20 years.
Where are we then on the kind of like the Brexit Britain to global Britain path?
Well, the integrated review, which appeared in March this year, was exactly the right thing to do. It was exactly appropriate to our issue. The question is whether we are being consistent with it, and I worry that the integrated review is dribbling away in several different directions. That it looks a bit like a tick box exercise. We've done that. We've thought about it. We've said all the right things. Now move on. Well, having said all the right things, we've now got to do all the right things. And I worry that too many of our policies at the moment are strategically incoherent. But the integrated review was a very important first big step. I just wish we'd stick with it.
I want to ask you both, if I may, about the pandemic and the impact of the last 2 years on the sort of the global Britain endeavour. Has, Helen, a question I think for you really, has British vaccine development been absolutely pivotal to brand Britain? And not just vaccines in terms of COVID, I also mean malaria and others as well.
It's certainly emerging as
at the most important moment. Mike, do you want to pick up while we try and re-establish?
Yes. I mean, it's emerging as one of the big soft power pluses for it.
Helen, sorry, we lost you for just a second, and you froze as you were about to say something absolutely brilliant. Go ahead.
I'd say that the COVID it can be seen as something to Britain's detriment, or it may provide opportunities, and it's just too early to say. But in terms of the vaccine, it's undoubtedly elevated Britain on the world stage. There's only a few countries that have been able to develop at speed and scale something effective, affordable, and something approved by the worldwide international regulated community. So that is a really strong message. And it's one that the British government obviously are keen to harness. But it's a vulnerable position as well, because to create that, you need that research background, and a lot of British research is based on charitable funding, but for a considerable period of time, charitable funding came to a stop. Research came to a stop when labs closed and things. So it's both a strong card in Britain's hand at the moment, but it's vulnerable as well. So too soon to say on the vaccine, but certainly one to be very greatly celebrated.
And on the question of Britishness, whether that is in and of itself a soft power asset. You talked about sort of individualism, but I'm wondering whether just being British is something that we all intrinsically just have as a wonderful soft power attribute.
Well, it's funny. I live in a German-speaking time, and someone had a meme on their phone the other day where British was both it's like absolutely diabolical outside with a little bit of rain, but had a bit of an issue when the engine of their car was sort of on fire or something. So there's a sort of caricature of Britishness, but I think the Britishness that we draw out in the book is the values of openness, of tolerance, of respect for rule of law, international order. Those big values that we have to hold dear in our interactions with the international world.
And then, Mike, if I can come to you on this, then other values, think of British values, liberal freedom, honesty, the pursuit of prosperity, things like that. I mean, arguably, lockdowns as a result of COVID have quashed all of those things.
They've squashed the expression of them.
Yeah.
I don't think it's squashed the existence of them particularly, but it's certainly made it harder to express ourselves as a society. And that's one of the challenges of getting going again after COVID, which is why our vaccine program, I think, will turn out in the long run to have been good. I think that when people look back on it, the fact that we didn't handle our public health element very well won't matter as much, matters to us, but it won't matter to the outside world. The idea that we were leading on a vaccine program, that we vaccinated ourselves pretty efficiently, and that we emerged from the pandemic and got going again ahead of many other countries, or as fast as we reasonably could. I think that's what will resonate in 5 years or 10 years' time when people look back on COVID.
How should then the policymakers who are reading the book, perhaps those joining us today, how should Britain best take advantage of its soft power potential? Well,
there are some things that they can back, like the BBC, like the British Council. There are some institutions which the government can have some influence over, in fact control of in some respects. Most institutions would hate to be, and do hate to be, dragooned into the Foreign Office and given a briefing on what the British view of this or that is. They won't do it because it undermines their independence. But what the government can do is to think more carefully and harder about how to help create the environment in which these organisations prosper. A very good example, for instance, is tax breaks for the film industry. I mean, Hollywood is now beating a path to the door of British studios, which are going through halcyon years at the moment. They're going through, it's a golden age of British filmmaking. And a lot of that is based on early tax breaks, which create the momentum. And now we say, Hollywood wouldn't be Hollywood without Wardour Street. We are the world leaders in special effects. They're all done in Wardour Street, tiny little offices up in Bedford Row and around there. So the government can think of ways, and we mentioned some in the book, in which they can help to, as it were, nurture the environment in which independent organisations and British creativity can flourish. Mm-hmm. And there's lots of good news on that front.
And Helen, I want to, just before I'm going to get to questions from the audience in just a second, so please do start thinking about raising your hand for them. But Helen, I said I was going to ask a question about the Duke and Duchess of Sussex at some point. And Mike, don't worry, I won't come to you on this one. I'm just wondering, given the fact that next year is so big, the Platinum Jubilee, the Commonwealth Games, etc., have the Sussexes still got any power outside of the royal family? And is it any soft power? Any power at all, or is it just celebrity now?
Well, they certainly have power in terms of their attraction and the magnetism that they draw people towards them, and they'll draw people towards the causes that they want to promote. In terms of British soft power, it's complicated, and I think it's just such a shame how it's played out. And I think and possibly even unforeseen by them as well, the manner in which they left the UK, the grenades that were fired in the Oprah Winfrey interview, and these were a knock on the royal family and by extension then British reputation. But I guess it's like a lot of things, it's asking, are they sort of pinpricks in an image, or are they trends? And does the things that Harry and Meghan drew attention to, are they one-offs? Are they experienced widely? Are they trends? That's what will matter. I think the royal society, the royal family, and British society as a whole has a lot of elasticity. We saw that with Brexit. In many ways, the Brexit experience is interesting to me because it shows that a country can have bitterly divided experience and conflicting views, but it still holds. And so I think maybe an example of that, how elastic the royal family is in terms of soft power potential, we'll see. But I hope, as a family, I hope it can be resolved. It's very unpleasant to think of a divided family in that respect. So from that point, from there, firstly, hopefully some resolution. But for the reputation of the royal family, yes, I hope that they too can peacefully coexist between California and the UK.
Yeah, thank you. Let's go to some questions from the audience. Gentleman here.
Hi, Neville McNally.
I think we're just going to get a microphone, actually. Yes, so sorry, everyone, just raise your hand and wait for Jacqueline to run over.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Neville McNally. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I look forward to reading the book. Just picking up on the soft power theme and considering the success of British soft power over time, and whether that is not now being challenged increasingly in the sense that to exercise soft power there has to be a national consensus. And to an extent, what's happened has happened, and that's the testament of history. But perhaps over the last couple of years in particular, we have seen much more contention over what the national narrative is. And I'm not talking about, there is a mainstream media monopoly which supports a narrative, but increasingly we're seeing examples from outside the mainstream which would challenge. And what my question really comes down to whether the policymakers need to be more attentive to narratives that are beyond the mainstream.
Is your question to Michael, to
both? Yeah.
Well, okay, very, very briefly, Neville. Yes, you're absolutely right. The danger of a very pluralist society is that eventually it can drift so far that it doesn't look as if you can find a mainstream anymore. And we always used to know in the 30s, 40s and 50s where we thought the British mainstream was, but we're a significantly more multicultural society now. We always were multicultural, but it's taken different forms in recent years. And there is a sense, I think, in which it's too easy for governments to get pulled into culture wars, which are the downside of pluralism, if you like, as opposed to a more relaxed attitude towards a tolerant mainstream and a mainstream which is naturally more inclusive, naturally finds a way to bring in different areas and different ideas. So yes, there is a danger, and that's why I mentioned the problem of the dissolution of the United Kingdom. You know, if we do break up in the next 10 years or next 20 years, we could still survive that if it is handled in a way that demonstrates the values of tolerance, order, prosperity and opportunity. If we could hold on to those things and even break up the UK, then we'd get through it. But I suspect that would be very, very difficult to do. And the way in which the debate is handled will critically affect our mainstream. And we're not, on the face of it, we're not in a particularly good place at the moment as a consensual society. I worry that all of the robustness that we detect in the book is getting buried a bit more deeply.
Let's move on to some more questions. A gentleman in the front row. A short question. Wonderful.
Jonathan Paris. Did you mention language? Because to me, the English language is an enormous soft power advantage. Look at the former empire. All those countries, including mine, speak English. And indeed, I think most people, as Nixon pointed out in that quote from Helen, most people prefer not only the language of English, but they prefer the British accent as somewhat more authoritative.
Helen, do you want to take that?
Yes, because the spike of Peppa Pig accents in American schools was noted recently. Yes, English as the language of international business, air traffic control, all of these things we do touch on, and even the example that we begin with in the book of the Michael know it more eloquently, the capsule that went on Voyager 1. It was spoken from a message from Earth into outer space to reach any of our extraterrestrial friends. But of course, the language of it was in English and by an Austrian diplomat, as it were. I don't think we can take it for granted, however, and I don't think we can assume that English will be the international language in 25 years' time. So I think that's something that in terms of being a competitor, we need to upskill in our language capacities. And I'm very acutely aware of it living abroad, where English is helpful, but not always. You can't assume it anymore, is what I believe.
And with a daughter who's apparently fluent in German now as well, speaking that at home. I think in the middle row here, this gentleman with the glasses on.
Thank you. Konrad Jagodziński, Brand Finance. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for including Brand Finance's Nation Brands and Global Soft Power Index rankings in the book. Very pleased to see that. And my question concerns rankings. Which countries do you think Britain should benchmark its soft power performance against? Or, in other words, which countries do you think Britain is actually competing in the soft power space against?
I mean, in terms of analog countries, you're really talking about France, Germany, United States is the other. I mean, that's number one in most cases for most things, but not always, and the US has slipped as well in recent years. So those are the obvious. We think about ourselves as part of a United States league, and in some respects, when you look at publishing and innovation, you're looking at China, America, and the UK. And then there's a big gap to the others. And there's some quite significant rankings in which show that, very specific things. But the ultimate competitors are the Asian competitors, of course. This is the Asian century. And so, Voyager 1, as Helen mentioned, was set off in 1977 with a message to the aliens in English. If Voyager 25 is launched in 2077, it'll probably carry a message in Mandarin.
Mm. Front row, and then I'll come to you, sir, afterwards.
Thank you. Hookie Walker, former diplomat. Question for Michael. You said that it's up to government to set the environment in which aspects of soft power can flourish. Does that mean a requirement for a new bit of government machinery, committee of officials or committee of ministers, or would that be death?
Well, there's a soft power department in the Foreign Office now, which we've been tracking, but there's about 15 people in it. It's not huge. It's not doing nothing, and about 300 million a year of the programme budget of the Foreign Office is said to be spent on soft power activities, but I think that's just a reclassification of what they were doing anyway. So it's not that the Foreign Office is not doing something, but it's ticking boxes on soft power more than it is shifting towards a new emphasis on soft power. But one of the things that we say is that there's lots of ways in which government could tighten up on what they're doing. We've got examples in the book. They could certainly review soft power. A review in itself would be a very interesting and useful exercise. And there's lots more they could do to unite the public and private sector. Again, we all know there's lots of these things take place, but they tend to depend on the interest of one minister. And when that minister moves on, then it sort of collapses again or just drifts away. There's lots of things government could do to be more alert to the longevity of soft power influence and trying to affect the external environment. We are, in general, Britain comes across to other countries as having a lot of soft power, but being rather complacent about it. And I think probably we are.
Yes, sorry, and then if we can pass the microphone behind afterwards to you, sir. Thank you.
Hello, Ben Papworth from MBDA. Michael, earlier you said that governments might find it difficult to find soft power levers. Do you think that climate action is one of those levers, and to what extent do you think a country going green demonstrates prosperity?
Yeah, very good point. Really good point. Because climate action is something of which there are now levers that weren't there 10 years ago, in the sense that 10 years ago, governments did not give themselves the powers that they now think they can give themselves and exercise. And the degree to which climate action and the climate emergency will become a global issue that affects perceptions is, I don't know where that's going at the moment, but it may go in the direction of prosperity, law and opportunity, and environmental sustainability. Maybe will become a fourth element. If that is the case, then yes, it would be the first case that I can think of where quite specific policy levers are available to a definable, broad soft power outcome. The globalists in writing always argue that a problem anywhere in the world is a problem everywhere. That's never actually true. It's just not true. But on climate action, it may turn out to be the first case in human history where it is true. COVID might be the second case in human history where it is true, where unless we deal with the problem everywhere, then we can't deal with it anywhere. That is a possibility. It's never existed, in my view, before in human history.
I would just add that we look at climate change, we look at Extinction Rebellion and things like the Ecocide campaign in one of our chapters on education and pursuing truth and truthfulness. And they're really interesting how examples of evolving from ground up in XR's case from around the table in Cotswolds example. The Ecocide campaign's a really interesting one of melding legal expertise with the needs of climate change. So in terms of thinking creatively for solutions to global problems, I think there's good examples in one of our chapters on Britain's soft power reputation for being solution finders.
Would you like to go ahead, sir?
Clemens Kohnen, German Embassy. I have a question, I think, mainly for Helen. You've mentioned the B word before, so I'll raise it again, Brexit. I would argue was a sort of a divorce from one of the big, sort of say, the powers that he could have used for the aims you've described today. Done and dusted. Do you see any future alliances on pushing soft power with other partners? It is British Persuaders, I've understood. It sounds like a national project, but many of the soft powers you've mentioned are very similar to the ones we have.
Yes. Do you mean in terms of British and German
British, French? Yeah. British, German, British, French, for example. British, Italian, British, Polish.
Sorry, I'm losing you there.
Sorry, Helen, I think the question was about British-German collaboration as well in the future.
Yes, well, I think in terms of Britain's making a great success of Global Britain, our partners, our alliances in all spheres is instrumental to that, and getting out fast, building alliances to the solutions and things is absolutely critical. So where with our similar thinking allies, yes, I completely agree. I don't think I properly heard the question. I'm really sorry whether Mike has another point to add to that.
Yeah, I just thought a very quick point on that. We have a self-image of ourselves, which I think has been generally true, that we are practical and focused and we get things done. Now, we haven't been as good at that in the last 10 years as we should have been, but that's our image. And it isn't just a political image, it's an image in organisations. So when you're dealing with regulatory organisations around the world, there has been a view that, British executives have been overrepresented on many management organisations and international organisations because they get on with it, they're practical, they don't go drifting off into the realms of philosophy. We're shopkeepers, basically. And that actually is a great asset. And it isn't just a political asset, it's a social asset. And one of the challenges we've got in this book is to keep that real, to keep the reality of that to the forefront of the way in which we do see ourselves.
I think we might have time for just one very quick question. I think you have the microphone, sir. Thank you.
To take that point forward, to build on your point and Lord Lothian's, where we're talking about building global Britain, turning that into reality is going to be largely defined by the trade deals that we're able to strike. And the position that you've just articulated, where we've had a history of being able to do things and being practical, but it doesn't look so far like we're necessarily going to be that capable of striking deals on the terms that we want. And then particularly through the Brexit process, where our negotiators were often on the back foot. And now we've found ourselves signing up to things that we are trying to sidestep out of, and we are having a spotlight turned on us for doing that. To what extent do you think, in some ways, our leading position as being respectful of the rule of law is creating a rod for our backs, where we have to argue, and be sort of whiter than white, as it were, and that we'll struggle to kind of live up to that?
Yeah, soft power can live with that for a short period. So because we're talking about society and broader trends, governments can make a mess of things now and again, and it doesn't really matter. But if it's consistent, if they keep doing it over a couple of decades, then of course it affects the way in which the rest of the world sees you. And when you've lost a certain sort of reputation, it's quite hard to get it back. And so the danger we face is that unless our governments behave more consistently with the bases of our society as we define them here in the book, then I think the danger is we will slip quite quickly down that slope, which is why we say that the situation that we're in is both better and worse. It's better because there is robustness, but it's worse because the challenges there are really quite heavy.
And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we are out of time, I'm afraid. But I would urge you all to, as Lord Lothian has already said, to go and buy the book, read the book. Reviews already in are from the likes of Elliot Higgins, the founder of Bellingcat, Karen von Hippel, the Director General of RUSI, and Lord William Hague of Richmond, former Foreign Secretary, of course, as well, to name but a few. So thank you all so much for joining us here. Thank you, Lord Lothian, for inviting us all as well. And thank you to Professor Mike Clarke and to Helen Ramscar as well.